So you take in different foodstuff which are utilized by the body. So some amount of oxygen is consumption in the oxidation of the foodstuff. So in this respiratory quotient of foodstuff, when you try to measure this, you ask the subjects to breathe in the atmospheric air of known composition. You should know how much oxygen is being taken in by the subject, and the expired air is collected in a rubber bag, and you measure the volume of the expired air, the oxygen content in the expired air, and the carbon dioxide content in the expired air. You know how much the subject is taking in the inspired air because you know the composition of the given atmospheric air. And using those, you calculate the respiratory quotient, which is carbon dioxide expired by the subject to the amount of oxygen consumed. So this gives you the respiratory quotient of foodstuff. Look at this, and this is the formula of what? This is glucose, and this shows that as the carbohydrates are completely oxidized, their respiratory quotient is close to 1. This gives the representation of glucose. This reaction shows the oxidation of glucose, and you balance both sides, and you can see that amount of carbon dioxide expired and amount of oxygen consumed. You divide the amount of carbon dioxide expired by amount of oxygen consumed, and you get 1. So the respiratory quotient of carbohydrates is 1. Fats, they have relatively lower respiratory quotient because they have low oxygen content. This is the example given of the fat tristyrene, and from here you can see that the respiratory quotient is about zero point 0.7. About proteins, their chemical nature is highly variable, and you cannot establish the respiratory quotient by any specific formula. So, by indirect measurement, they have found the respiratory quotient of protein to be around zero point 0.8. And when you take a mixed diet composed of all the different things, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, normally in a normal diet, the respiratory quotient is found to be zero point 0.8. So this respiratory quotient value, it indicates which macronutrients are being metabolized as different energy pathways are used for fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. So this might be asked in MCQs. The respiratory quotient of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and mixed diet. Please learn these numbers. 1 for carbohydrates, 0.7 for fat, 0.8 for proteins, and 0.8 for mixed diet. Now you consume different micro and macronutrients. The energy given by the macronutrients are utilized for the various processes in the body. So the energy that is generated by the metabolism of macronutrients is used for mainly three energy requiring processes that occur in the body. First is to maintain the basal metabolic rate, which consumes about 60% of the total energy. Next is to perform all the physical activities, which takes about 30% of the total energy. And lastly, it is specific dynamic action or thermic effect of the food, which requires about 10% of the energy. So you can say that a person consumes energy, food, to meet the fuel demands of these three ongoing processes in the body: basal metabolic rate, physical activity, and specific dynamic action. Total energy expenditure is basically how many calories your body burns or utilizes. Number of calories expended by these three processes in a 24-hour period. You are taking in all those macronutrients to meet these requirements: basal metabolic rate, physical activity, and specific dynamic action or thermic effect of food. Now, what is basic basal metabolic rate? It is the energy expended by an individual in a resting post absorptive state. BMR is how much calories your body utilizes to maintain the vital functions. So you're just lying in the bed all day. You are doing nothing, eating nothing. You're just lying there. Even then, your body consumes some calories. So the calories that is consumed by your body in a resting state, in post absorptive state, is what is your BMR. Even though the body appears to be totally at rest, several important functions are continuously going on in the body. All those involuntary activities like working of the heart and the other organs, nerve conduction, and your kidneys are working, and there is gastrointestinal motility going on. So, all those activities require some amount of energy, even though the person seems to be totally at rest. That is what is basal metabolic rate, and you need some amount of calories to maintain this. So, this basal metabolic rate, it is the energy required to carry out all the body's involuntary work to maintain life. The normal value of basal metabolic rate is for adult man it is 35 to 38 calorie per square meter per hour, and for an adult woman it is 32 to 35 calorie per square meter per hour. There are different factors that affect the basal metabolic rate. It is BMR is BMR is directly proportional to the surface area. Surface area is related to the weight and height of an individual, and it is also affected by sex of an individual. Like men have slightly higher BMR than women, and it is also found to be higher in infants and growing children, and BMR decreases as the age advances, and it is also increased in persons with higher level of physical activity. The hormones like thyroid hormones, epinephrine, cortisol, growth hormone, sex hormone, they all increase basal metabolic rate. And BMR is found to be increased in cold climates as compared to the warm climates. And it is found to be decreased during the period of starvation. So you can see that the energy intake has an inverse relation with BMR. It is also found to be increased in fever and in disease states like in case of infections, leukemias, cardiac failure, and hypertension. So these are all the different factors that affect the basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate, what is basal metabolic rate? It is the calories being consumed by your body in resting state in the post absorptive period. What is the significance of BMR? Why is it important to know the BMR of an individual? Because it is important to calculate the calorie requirement of an individual and planning of diets, because the body needs calories for three processes. One is maintenance of basal metabolic rate, another is physical activity, and another is specific dynamic action. So these are the three processes that require energy, out of which BMR is important. So if you know the BMR, you can plan the diet of an individual. So there are different methods, various formulas have been devised to measure the BMR. When you prepare the subject should be awake at complete physical and mental rest and in comfortable surrounding. And the measurement can be done by two methods. One is using the apparatus of Benedict and Roth and Douglas Bag method. So also various formulas have been devised that use age, weight and height to calculate the BMR. The next process in the body that requires calories or energy is the physical activity. You need energy to do physical activity. So, the total energy expenditure of an individual, of various individual, is widely different, and the major major factor that provides this greatest variation is in the total energy expenditure is the physical activity. The amount of energy consumed depends on the duration and intensity of the exercise. So if you take into account a sedentary worker and a manual worker, then obviously the level of physical activity is highly different, which provides the greatest variation in total energy expenditure. For a sedentary person, the requirement is 30 to 50% above the basal metabolic rate, whereas for a very active person, it requires 100% above the basal metabolic rate. The energy required is 100% above the basal metabolic rate for a very active person. Now look at this chart. The expenditure of energy for various physical activity has been calculated. So if you are working in an office, you sit in the table and you work quietly, the energy requirement is only about 25 calories per hour. But if you're walking upstairs or swimming, the calorie requirement is very high, like 600 calories per hour and 800 calories per hour. You don't have to learn all these. This is just to show you that there is wide variation in the energy requirement depending on the level of physical activity. Another process that requires energy is the specific dynamic action or thermic effect of the food. The amount of energy expenditure above the basal metabolic rate due to the cost of food processing for use and storage is the thermic effect of the food. It is this term, specific dynamic action or thermic effect of food, it is the cost of digesting the food. Your body just does not burn calories during exercise. It also requires calorie during digestion as well. So the thermic effect of food is the caloric cost of digesting and processing different macronutrients in the diet. This is the thermic effect of the food. Production of heat by the body increases as much as 30% above the resting level during digestion and absorption of the food due to thermic effect of the food. So over a 24-hour period, the thermic response to food intake may amount to a significant amount of total energy expenditure. You take in food, you ingest food which stimulates metabolism and requires energy to meet the multiple activities of digestion, absorption, metabolism, and storage of the nutrients, and energy requirement is also different for different types of food you ingest. Look at this chart. The specific dynamic action of protein is 30%, fat is 13%, carbohydrate is 5%, and that of a mixed diet is 10%. So as I said, for the utilization of food by the body, some amount of energy is consumed from the body store. This is actually an expenditure by the body for the utilization of foodstuff. Even though the same foodstuff give you energy later on, but for their utilization, the first step, you need energy. And this requirement is highest for the proteins and lowest for carbohydrates. SDA of food is due to the energy that is required for digestion, absorption, transport, metabolism, and storage. For example, the SDA of carbohydrates is due to the energy expenditure, energy that is required to convert glucose to glycogen. Thermic effect of the food shows how much energy your body utilizes in digesting that type of food. So let's take example of fat. If you consume fat having 100 kilocalorie energy, you consume amount of fat that gives you 100 kilocalorie of energy. 13% of that 100 kilocalorie is used up in the process of digestion and absorption and everything. And only about 87 kilocalorie of the consumed food would be possible for the body either to utilize it or store it. So if you consume 100 kilocalorie of fat, only 13%, about 87 kilocalorie will be available for the body for either for utilization or storage. The rest of the energy is consumed in digesting and absorbing it. Protein has a very high thermic effect, about 30%. So around only 70%, if you consume, like only about 70% of the consumed protein will be there for utilization of the body. 30% will be spent in specific dynamic action. So only 70% is all the body is going to be left to utilize. So all these nutrients have their own importance in the body. Carbohydrate is the chief source of energy and it contributes about 60 to 70% of total caloric requirement of the body. Carbohydrates utilized by the body are starch, glycogen, sucrose, lactose, glucose, fructose, and carbohydrates not utilized by the body are cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin, gums. So all the carbohydrates are not utilized. You know this. Carbohydrates are the major sources of energy. When you take enough amount of carbohydrate, it protects the protein. Proteins are not degraded, and glucose is also required by glucose is the only source of energy for tissues like erythrocytes, and brain also prefers to use carbohydrate glucose for generation of energy. So there are different functions of carbohydrates in the body. I want you to list out all the functions of carbohydrates. This is Take this as an assignment. List down the different functions of carbohydrates in the body. So let's talk about this term, glycemic index. Only knowing the total. So okay, if you consume when you consume carbohydrates, your blood glucose level is going to fluctuate. But only knowing the amount and type of carbohydrate in a food is not enough to predict the effect on blood glucose fluctuation. So there are some food that are rich in complex carbohydrates that raise the blood glucose very quickly, and some food they raise the blood glucose level only by a little and slowly. So this glycemic index was devised to see which of the carbohydrate containing food raise the blood sugar level highly and abruptly, and which of the sugar containing food they increase slowly. So this glycemic index is just a number that is associated with carbohydrates in a particular type of food that indicates the level effect of these carbohydrates on a person's blood glucose level. So how is glycemic index calculated? So let's look at this graph. The y-axis shows the rise in blood glucose level and the x-axis shows the time period. This 15 minutes interval. So this timeline shows about 2 hours. So what you do is you take 50 gram of glucose solution in water and you give it to a group of individuals. 50-gram glucose in water and you give people to drink it. For the next 2 hours, you draw blood at regular intervals, like maybe every 15 minutes you draw blood and you measure the blood glucose level after giving glucose, 50-gram glucose in solution, and you plot the blood glucose level and you make this graph. So in this example, the blood glucose it peaks between 30 minutes and 1 hour. So here is the peak of blood glucose level. And after doing that, and after 2 hours, it comes back to the basal line. So after doing this, after plotting this graph, you measure the area beneath this curve. The area beneath this blue curve, this area is measured. And if you measure the area beneath this curve, it will be proportional to the amount of glucose that is in the bloodstream during this period. Then in the next step, what you do is you take the same subjects and have them eat the test food. For example, a ball of brown rice. How much rice do you give? You give the amount of rice that contains 50 gram of carbohydrates. Not 50 gram of brown rice, but the amount of brown rice that has the 50 gram of carbohydrates. And you do the same experiment. You give the brown rice and you measure the blood glucose level every 15 minutes on those same individuals. So and you make this graph. In this graph, you can see that the peak is almost at the same time, about 30 minutes, but it is lower than when the same individuals had consumed blood. When these same individuals had consumed pure glucose, and you can also see that the fall is slower. And then you do the same thing. You calculate the area under the curve for the brown rice and you divide this result by the area value of the area under the curve for glucose and you multiply by 100. The number you get is the glycemic index. The glycemic index it shows how fast the carbohydrates in a food enter the bloodstream and raise the blood glucose level. So you can see that when you consume pure glucose, the rise in blood glucose is higher and the fall down is quicker than when you consume brown rice. But it does not measure the extent of this effect because it is independent of the amount of carbohydrates contained in a food. Now, to make it clearer, let's take this example. So, The term glycemic index, it only makes sense if we consider another term, glycemic load. For example, let's take this carrot. The glycemic index of carrot is 72, meaning the blood glucose rises quickly, falls quickly, than compared to potatoes whose glycemic index is 63, lower than the carrots. But the amount of carbohydrates contained in carrot is very low. An average sized carrot, it contains only about 4 gram of carbohydrates. This means that even though the sugar enters the bloodstream quickly, but as the sugar is very low in amount, the overall effect of carrots on blood glucose is minimum compared to this average size potato whose carbohydrate content is 25 gram. So even though the glycemic index is only 63, but this contains significant amount of carbohydrates, so obviously the effect on the blood glucose will be more. So even if these carbohydrates, even if they enter the bloodstream slowly, they still have significant effect on the blood glucose level because it is high in amount. So keeping this in mind, the concept of glycemic load was proposed, which considers both the glycemic index and the carbohydrates contained in grams. So you calculate the glycemic load of this carrot and this potato. Glycemic glycemic load is equivalent to glycemic index 72 multiplied by carbs contained 4 gram divided by 100. And so you compare, you find out the glycemic load of both of these and you compare. I think the glycemic load of carrot, it comes to be around 3, and that of potato, it comes to be around 16. The glycemic load of potato is more than 5 times that of carrot, even though glycemic index is lower. So when you devise a diet plan, especially for diabetics, you have to consider the glycemic load and not only the glycemic index. So what is glycemic index? It is the area under the blood glucose curve after the ingestion of food compared with the area under the blood glucose curve after taking the same amount of carbohydrate as glucose. So this is the definition of glycemic index. Glycemic index, it measures the time course of postprandial glucose concentrations from a graph. So this is the formula for calculating glycemic index: area under the blood glucose curve after ingestion of test meal divided by area under the curve after ingestion of glucose multiplied by 100. So this formula gives you glycemic index. Glycemic index is ranked on a scale from 0 to 100 according to the extent to which they raise the blood glucose levels after eating. High glycemic index food, they are rapidly digested, absorbed and metabolized, and they result in marked fluctuation in the blood glucose level, whereas the food with lower glycemic index, they produce smaller fluctuations in blood glucose and insulin level. So the food that have lower glycemic index, they are better, especially for the diabetics. You do not want the blood glucose level to fluctuate rapidly. So that is why you try to give food which have lower glycemic index and lower glycemic load. So coming to the proteins, protein in the food, it provides the essential amino acid. I hope you know the names of the essential amino acids. These are the amino acids that the body cannot synthesize and they need to be provided by diet. An adult has about 100 gram of free amino acids. This represents the body amino acid pool. The body amino acid pool is maintained by the sources that contribute to it and the metabolic pathway that utilize the amino acid. The turnover of the body proteins, the dietary proteins, and synthesis of non-essential amino acids, they contribute to the body amino acid pool. It is estimated that about 354 to 400 gram of protein is constantly degraded in the body, and almost the same amount is being synthesized in the body. This represents the body protein turnover. So how is this amino acid utilized? There is regular loss from the body, protein loss from the body, which is about 30 to 50 gram per day, and mostly as urea in the urine. So this loss, it should be supplied by the diet, and this amino acid, it is also required for the synthesis of non-protein compounds like creatine and porphyrins, purines, pyrimidines. The excess intake of amino acids are also metabolized to provide energy and convert to carbohydrate or fat. So this is the amino acid pool. Intake and protein breakdown, it contributes to it, and the loss and being converted to other substances utilizes it. Nitrogen balance. So what is nitrogen balance? What is the source of nitrogen in the body? The source of nitrogen in the body are the dietary proteins, which are almost the exclusive source of nitrogen in the body. So this nitrogen balance is determined by comparing intake and excretion of nitrogen. Nitrogen balance, it represents protein utilization and its loss from the body. How much nitrogen does protein have? It is about 16% nitrogen. Intake is protein intake, and excretion is via feces, undigested protein, and via urine converting to urea. So if the intake and output of nitrogen are the same, then the person is said to be in nitrogen balance. A normal healthy adult is in nitrogen equilibrium or nitrogen balance, since the daily dietary intake is equal to the loss through the urine and feces. So why do we talk about nitrogen balance? Because we can measure the nitrogen. Nitrogen is a component of amino acid, and we can measure the nitrogen. So when you say that a person is in nitrogen balance, you know that they have the same amount of total protein in their body at all times. So measuring the nitrogen input and loss nitrogen, you can do the study of protein metabolism. So, positive nitrogen balance is said when some amount of nitrogen is retained in the body, causing net increase in body protein. Normally, the person is in nitrogen balance or equilibrium, but sometimes there is positive nitrogen balance, which means that some of the nitrogen is retained in the body, causing net increase in body protein. And this is seen in growing children, pregnant women, and during recovery after serious illnesses. Sometimes there is some amount of nitrogen lost from the body, depleting the body protein, and this is said to be negative nitrogen balance. Nitrogen output is higher than the input, and this is observed in case of destruction of tissues, serious illnesses, and inadequate intake of calories. But only the knowledge of on the quantity of the dietary protein, only knowing how much protein is being consumed is not sufficient to evaluate the nutritional importance of protein. You also have to consider the quality of the protein, and this quality of protein, it depends on the composition of essential amino acids. So several laboratory methods are used to assess the nutritive value of the proteins. There is this term PDCAAS, protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. So the quality of protein, it depends on the how much essential amino acids are present, and also if these proteins are well digested or not. So considering the digestibility of proteins and the amino acids that are present, this score is given PDCAAS. So when you see this, you can see that it has 1, and it is the highest possible score under these guidelines. Similarly, milk protein has also 1, beef poultry has 0.82 to 0.92, and from the plant proteins, soybean protein has 1, kidney bean 0.68, whole wheat bread 0.4. So the animal source have higher quality of protein compared to the plant source, and also wheat is deficient in this. This whole wheat bread, it has got only 0.4 because wheat is deficient in lysine, and kidney beans are deficient in methionine. That is why these values are found to be lower. But if you have the knowledge of this PDCAAS score, then you can combine protein from different plant sources and you can have a healthy diet. Make sure that you're getting all the essential amino acid. For example, wheat is deficient in lysine but rich in methionine. This wheat, it may be combined with kidney beans that are deficient in methionine but rich in lysine to produce an improved quality of protein for consumption. So this is important. There is another term to evaluate the quality of the protein, and it is biological value. The formula for biological value is nitrogen incorporated in the body divided by nitrogen absorbed in proteins multiplied by 100. The biological value, it provides a good index for the nutritive value of proteins, but this method has a major drawback. It does not take into account the nitrogen that might be lost during the process of digestion. Now let's take this example. If you consume 100 gram of nitrogen, you are ingesting 100 gram of nitrogen. You don't consume nitrogen as such, you take it in form of proteins. This you know, right? So you're consuming 100 mg of nitrogen, and but this formula, it does not take into account how much nitrogen you are consuming in the food. It only takes into account how much nitrogen is absorbed and how much the body is retaining. So in this example, you are consuming 100 mg of nitrogen, and the nitrogen absorbed is only 10 mg and retained is 8 mg. So most is lost. The body is not absorbing it. Only 10 mg is being absorbed, whereas 90 mg is already lost. So this formula, it does not take into account the nitrogen that is lost. So according to this biological formula, you keep the values I've just given in the example. You are consuming 100 mg of nitrogen, which is there is no place to put that value in this formula. The body is retaining only 10. So in here Na you write 10, and nitrogen incorporated in the body is 8. So according to this formula, the value comes to be about 80, which is high. But there is error because major part of the protein, around 90 mg, does not enter the body for utilization. So that is why this biological value, this formula is not very useful, because it does not consider the amount of nitrogen that is lost during the digestion process. So there is another formula, net protein utilization, which is better than biological value because this takes into account the digestibility factor. It considers the amount of nitrogen that is ingested and the amount of nitrogen that is retained. So this gives a proper idea about the protein utilization and the quality of the protein. So this slide shows the requirement for proteins in the humans. The recommended dietary allowance for adults is 0.8 gram per kg body weight. For athletes, it is about 1 gram per kg body weight. For pregnant or lactating women, it is plus 30 gram per day above their basal requirements. So firstly, you use this formula to calculate the pregnant or lactating women's basic requirement, and you add 30 gram plus 30 gram per day, and you'll get the requirement during pregnancy or lactation. And for infants, it is about 2 gram per kg per day. But the amount of dietary protein required in the diet, it varies with its biologic value. The greater the proportion of animal protein included in the diet, the less protein is required because animal protein is better than plant protein. This is the daily requirement, but there is no physiologic advantage if you consume more protein than the RDA, because protein, when consumed in excess of the body's need, is deaminated, and the resulting carbon skeletons are metabolized to provide energy or acetyl CoA for fatty acid synthesis. So, when consuming the protein, you follow the RDA. Protein, there is protein sparing effect of carbohydrate. If you take carbohydrates in low amount, then substantial amount of protein is metabolized to provide precursors for gluconeogenesis. We have talked about this when we have talked about starvation. In case of starvation, when no glucose is coming in from the gut, the body, there is proteolysis going on, breaking down of the muscle proteins, and the amino acid, the major amount contributed by alanine and glutamine, they are utilized for the process of gluconeogenesis. So you know this, but if you consume carbohydrate in required amount, then proteins are spared. This is the protein sparing effect of carbohydrate, and we've talked about this during starvation. In a well balanced diet, the carbohydrates, they contribute at least 40% of the caloric needs of the body. The fats, they contribute at least 20 to 30% of the daily calorie requirement, and the protein, they contribute about 10 to 15% of the body energy needs. So a well balanced diet should contain carbohydrates, proteins, and fat in these amount. Another topic, protein energy malnutrition. When those requirements are not met in long term, you end up with protein energy malnutrition. There are two types of protein energy malnutrition, kwashiorkor and marasmus. In kwashiorkor, protein deprivation is relatively greater than the reduction in total calories. The child, this occurs in children. So when the children, when they do not get enough amount of protein in the diet for a long time, the result is kwashiorkor. When there is protein deprivation, there is decreased synthesis of visceral protein. Protein are not made in the body as well. This is commonly seen in developing countries in children after weaning at about age 1 year. Till 1 year, only the breast milk is sufficient for the baby. After that, they need supplement food as well. So when the supplemental food, when it is deprived of protein for a long time, then the result is the child suffers from kwashiorkor. If the diet, if it contains only carbohydrates, no proteins is given, the children should be given a protein rich diet, like they should be given eggs and meat and soybean. If they are not given, and if they're only given rice and only bread and rice, only the carbohydrate containing food, they get kwashiorkor. There is insufficient intake of proteins in the diet after weaning. Weaning means in addition to the breast milk, you give supplements as well. So the symptoms are stunted growth, the child does not grow. There is edema, swelling of the face, swelling of the abdomen, swelling of limbs. There is edema and moon face, expressionless face, dull face, and there are various skin lesions as well. The hair, it loses its pigmentation, and the liver, there is fatty liver, and the child is irritable when picked up but apathetic when left alone. They remain dull and they are not very active. So this is what happens when the diet is deprived of proteins. In kwashiorkor, these are the biochemical features. Serum albumin is decreased. Serum potassium is decreased, and there is vitamin deficiency as well. The treatment is protein rich food should be given, and they should be monitored by measuring plasma albumin concentration and disappearance of edema and gaining body weight. You know that the child is getting better when the plasma albumin concentration, when it comes to the normal range, the swelling or edema disappears and the child starts to gain weight. Keep this in mind. In kwashiorkor, there is decrease in serum albumin level, and it is occurring because there is protein. The child is only given carbohydrate rich meal. You should be able to differentiate between the two types of protein energy malnutrition. We just talked about kwashiorkor. Now there is another protein energy malnutrition, which is marasmus, and you should be able to differentiate between the two. In marasmus, calorie deprivation is relatively greater than the reduction in protein. Usually occurs in children less than 1 year when breast milk is supplemented with watery gruels of native cereal that are deficient in both protein and calories. Marasmus, it literally means to waste. It is due to calorie deprivation. The child is not getting enough amount of calories. Symptoms: growth is stopped, arrested growth, extreme muscle wasting, loss of subcutaneous fat, weakness. The children are alert and irritable. So this is one of the difference. In kwashiorkor, the baby is dull or pathetic also. But in marasmus, they are alert and irritable. In kwashiorkor, there is edema present, swelling. But in marasmus, these babies are wasting. There is no edema. In kwashiorkor, serum albumin was decreased, but in marasmus, serum albumin is normal, so there is no edema. Please keep this in mind. A marasmic child does not show edema or decreased concentration of plasma albumin. So this is a major difference to distinguish marasmus and kwashiorkor. Now please go through this case study. A 9-month-old girl was brought to the clinic in an irritable state. Weight and height was much lower than expected. Mid-arm circumference and triceps thickness were very low for age. There is wasting. Arms are thinner than what should be. Mother tells that she had stopped breastfeeding at the age of 6 months and was now only giving formula milk. Normally, formula fed babies they do not get marasmus. Do not be confused. But if it is diluted, there is a certain procedure for making the formula milk. But if you make it in a dilute form, if you add a lot of water and only a little amount of formula and make it dilute, then it gives rise to some sort of protein energy malnutrition. And her serum albumin level was normal. So there is no history of edema, and her serum albumin was also normal. So what is this? Is it kwashiorkor or is it marasmus? Please answer me, anyone.
Marasmus.
Marasmus. Okay. In your spotters, if you're given such cases, please do not only write protein energy malnutrition. You write marasmus, and in the bracket you can write protein energy malnutrition if you want to, but just don't write only PEM. Okay, next one. A 4 years old boy with lethargic appearance was brought to the hospital. The weight and height were much lower than expected for this age group. The mother says that the child's diet consists of bread, milk, roti, and rice. No mention of any protein giving food anywhere. On examination, there is edema of the ankles and feet. The abdomen appears to be distended and the liver can be palpated. The serum albumin was found to be low. There are all the hints: edema present, liver palpated, and serum albumin low. So, what is this?
Kwashiorkor.
Kwashiorkor. Another type of protein energy malnutrition. This is the case of kwashiorkor. So, I hope all of you are able to distinguish between the two protein energy malnutritions if it is given in your spotters, which it most probably will be given. So, okay. So, this completes our gastrointestinal system. So, from the next class, hepatobiliary system will be started.